So John studied at the military staff colleges of both Canada and Thailand, the Thai Royal Military Staff College. John had a distinguished career in Australia's military and military intelligence areas, including as Director of Joint Intelligence Operations at Australia's Joint Operations Command Headquarters in Canberra. John served as Defense Attaché for Australia in both Thailand and Myanmar. And he served as the official historian of both the Australian Signals Intelligence Directorate, the Australian Signals Directorate and the Australian Security Intelligence Organization. For those of you interested in Thai military and Thai security issues, John wrote a fantastic book, which I highly recommend, called The U.S.-Thai Alliance in Asian International Relations, based both on archival work and many interviews with people across the Thai military. And that book came out in 2021. More recently, John just published, I believe, an unofficial history of Australian signals intelligence, which I look forward to reading as well. So with that, I will pass the floor to John, and John will tell us about the challenges facing Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that very warm and generous introduction. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here with you, ladies and gentlemen. Minglaba Sawadee Salamat Siang, Ni Hao, and I can't think of a few others right now, but there's a few greetings from the region that hopefully will warm a couple of cockles of people's hearts along the way. Ben Giet Yang Sung, Tidami Yogatma, Haibanye Wani. That's a little bit of a pontificating in Thai for you. But what I wanted to do is really, you're probably figuring this out. I love maps, right? And this one is my favourite one. It's a map centred on Darwin, the northern capital city in Australia, but spun 45 degrees to give you a sense of Australia hanging off Asia. And also the idea of the Indo-Pacific, what the outgoing Indonesian President Joko Widodo described as the maritime fulcrum. That space that connects the two oceans, the two great oceans, that is an incredibly contested space, an incredibly consequential space, geostrategically, geoeconomically as well, and we'll touch a little bit on that as we go along. But there we have it, and of course, this is a view of the world that you only get when you come down under. And this is why I think it's useful when we think about engaging with Asia, to think about the view from down under. And of course, as Richard's pointed out, I am a pontificating professor. I do like to write books. They keep me entertained. I was having coffee with Professor Brenda Croft, who's the Whitlam Fraser Chair here at Harvard at the moment. And we're both saying, I think we're kind of people that can't help ourselves. If we stop, things are going to unravel. So we just have to keep ourselves busy. But along the way, a fair number of the things I've done have been focused on Southeast Asian affairs. And these are the ones listed here, and Richard's touched on several of them. Very kindly, Richard, thank you. So this is the background that's informing my remarks today. But also this geostrategic SWOT analysis for Australia, which I conducted a couple of years ago, which is the paper you can download for free from the ANU. And in that, I looked at applied the business model of a SWOT, where you look at the internal strengths and weaknesses and external opportunities and threats. And I applied them to the nation of Australia and to the region in which it sits. And I thought I was really clever when I did this, and I came up with the table there on the top left, and I showed it to my wife, and I said, gee, what do you reckon? How impressive is that? And she says to me, so what, John? Brutal, right? I'm just blown away. But of course, she's right. So what, right? It's just a tabulated list of factors. And so I had to think deeper, and that's where I went. And I thought, okay, as I distilled this further, what I came up with this Venn diagram, which is what applies to Australia's circumstances, but really apply to all of us. And what I want to do is think about how it applies in the Southeast Asian context. But we're dealing with great power competition. We're dealing with looming environmental catastrophe, and we're dealing also with a spectrum of governance challenges. People smuggling, drug smuggling, terrorism, breakdown of law and order, civil war, and then it's all accelerated by the fourth industrial revolution. And it's doing our heads in, because who owns that space in the middle? Who's What intellectual academic discipline does that bit? What jurisdiction covers that? What organisation in government or society covers that? I can't think of one, right? We all have bits of it, but no one's got the whole picture. And of course, the world we're living in is much like that famous movie. It's everything, everywhere, all at once. And another way of describing it is the polycrisis. This is the World Economic Forum's view of it, but essentially there's a confluence of views emerging from people who are trying to get the macro sense of the challenge we're facing, and it is a spectrum of global security challenges that are affecting us all on economic, environmental, political, human, cyber, maritime, territorial, and homeland security fronts. And as I say, who owns this? It's really problematic. Now, I wanted to talk about how the world does look different from where we sit in the southern corner of Asia, the southeastern corner of Asia, where Australia is adjacent to Southeast Asia. And of course, for the United States, the presence of the Pacific it looks different from down under. And I guess this is the key message I want to get across, that when you're thinking about scholarship, when you're thinking about engagement with the world, really useful to think about it from where we sit. Also, of course, mindful of how it looks from China. And this is, of course, really important when we think about the challenges, because China looms so large in many of our equations in a way that Japan did 30 years ago. And the question is how that's going to shape things into the future. But as I say, from where we sit, Southeast Asia and this part of the world is not the Far East, it's not the Far West, it's the near North. It's our neighbourhood. But of course, this neighbourhood is one that lacks coherent resolve. We talk about unity and diversity. It's more an aspirational statement than a statement of fact, okay? This is not a united place. It is incredibly diverse, though. And it's diverse because of so many factors. This has got ethnic, religious, economic, historical, geographic, political, strategic, cultural, and linguistic diversity beyond most people's comprehension. It is gobsmacking how diverse this is, and yet how this grouping of 10, maybe 11 countries, if you include Timor-Leste, how it hangs together at all. You know, that compares Singapore to Brunei, Laos to Indonesia, the contrast, religious, cultural, economic, it's so diverse, it's amazing. This is not like Europe, which has the echoes of Christendom, medieval Christendom, and Latin-derived script and language as the kind of the hook that holds it together. Southeast Asia has nothing of the sort. What on earth is it that holds us? Is it Sanskrit? Well, only in part. You know, it's certainly not Hinduism, and it's certainly not Buddhism, even though so half of Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, is mostly Theravada Buddhist, but then there's Mahayana Buddhism in Vietnam, which is in quite stark contrast to the Theravada Buddhism of Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Thailand and Myanmar. And even then, you've got incredible diversity because of the history, etc. It's so complex. So when we look at this, we think also not just of that diversity, but of the geostrategic significance. And the Southeast Asian countries are acutely mindful of this because this has been where wars have been fought, okay? This is the land that has been traipsed through by colonial masters, the Dutch, the British, the French, the Americans, and more. And of course, the Japanese in the Second World War. And of course, this is something that from an Australian point of view is something, and I look at this also as a historian, as something that resonates today because of the history of our engagement in this part of the world. The sea lines of communication, the straits, Australia's maritime zones, its exclusive economic zones, and its maritime responsibility zones in the Indian and Pacific Oceans and the Southern Ocean. And of course, the fact that when we have faced an existential crisis in the past, which I would argue was in 1942, it came through what is now the Indonesian archipelago, what was then the Dutch East Indies. Okay, of course, that space itself is where so much of the world trade takes place. So much of the world trade transits through the waters of the South China Sea, and of course, what I like to describe as the jugular vein of the Indo-Pacific, the Malacca Strait. This is something that clearly drives Chinese engagement, Japan's concerns, Taiwan's, Korea's, etc. An overwhelming majority of their trade has to transit the Malacca Strait, leaving them extremely vulnerable to interception. Mindful of the fact, of course, that in January in 1941, the United States imposed sanctions on Japan, the likes of which scare the crap out of China. The prospect of such an embargo. Of course, the demography of Southeast Asia, the diversity speaks to the complexity of the challenges of making governance in Southeast Asia work. And it is remarkable that it does work when you think about how diverse that is in that space, and you see it's in this picture here. Of course, one of the most worrying concerns is the war in Myanmar, the civil war that has been a festering sore on the side of ASEAN that has made ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, a grouping of Southeast Asian countries, largely what Peter Varghese, the former Director General of our Office of National Intelligence, described it as a broken reed, leading some to conclude that engagement with ASEAN is hardly worth it. Better to deal bilaterally or multilaterally in sub-regional forums. And there is a certain case to be made that that is certainly true. And yet at the same time, ASEAN has a utility that endures. It still has a convening power that is unmatched. It has a utility in terms of, of enduring relevance that I think it's useful to think about what the world looked like before ASEAN existed. Now, as we know, correlation does not prove causation. And yet when we think about the correlation, it is extraordinary. This malaria-infested, poverty-stricken, war-torn region has been transformed in the years since 1967, since that form. Now, as I say, it's not the only factor, but clearly it is a consequential dynamic at play in this world. And when we think about the solutions to this problem, this is where I think it's really useful to reflect on when we have dealt with a crisis in Southeast Asia in the past and how we've responded to them. One of which is the crisis of the Paris Peace Accords of 1992-93, where Indonesian Foreign Minister Ali Alatas with Australian Foreign Minister Gareth Evans convinces the French and the Japanese to agree to an arrangement that will see the UN Transitional Authority of Cambodia emerge, and we see Cambodia brought back into the family of nations, if you like. A transformation that required Thai compliance, Thai agreement, because Thais were worried about this, and the Prime Minister of Thailand, General Chawalit Yongchayut, agreed that it was useful to turn battlefields into marketplaces. So there was a compelling economic rationale for Thailand to buy in. I would contend there is a similar potential dynamic at play with Thailand's other neighbour, Myanmar. There's another parallel which I think is worth comparing, and that is the one of the East Timor crisis of 1999. Now, at that time, I was the brigade intelligence officer with the Australian brigade that deployed to East Timor. And it was off the back of that I've been inspired to write about East Timor in the book East Timor Intervention and other things I've done in that space. But when we think about what happened in East Timor, very interesting. Australia did not want to upset or offend Indonesia. We had invested. In fact, we'd given a nudge, wink, wink, as Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger had done back in 1975 to support the invasion without officially doing so. And yet the killing of 5 Australian journalists on the border of Balibo when the Indonesians invaded led to a visceral reaction in the Australian media that was very hard to overcome politically, domestically in Australia, which meant that there was a fraught relationship for decades afterwards, even though the official policy was supportive of Indonesia. And then, of course, in 1998, John Howard writes a letter to Habibie, so the president who'd taken over from Suharto, who'd been overthrown in May 1998 after the riots there. And he says, look, maybe we can have something like a Matignon Accord. Well, of course, this incenses Habibie, who sees it an affront to be compared with colonial France. Right? And so the purpose of Howard's letter had a complete opposite effect. It triggered this absolute binary, of yes or no, you're in or out, that led to the unravelling in September 1999, which then led to Australian-led intervention. But Australia couldn't intervene without an ASEAN partner. And this is where the relationship with Thailand came in. really, really interesting. Thailand, a long second-tier partner to Australia. The Crown Prince, now the King of Thailand, studied at the military college where I myself studied a few years later than him. And the relationship had been a deep but low-key one. And the Thais appreciated that Australia was actually doing something constructive, much like it had done in 1992 over the Cambodia crisis. And so the Thais, after Australia had approached the Philippines, Singapore and Malaysia to partner up, they were, of course, living right next door to Indonesia, deeply worried about offending Indonesia, didn't want to do it. Understandable. Thailand, one step removed, recognising the utility of Australia's engagement in the region, saw that, in fact, it was in their interests to not let Australia fail. Volunteered to send General Songgidi Jagabak, the Deputy Force Commander, who'd been a defence attaché in Indonesia and had been to War College in London with Peter Cosgrove, the Australian general who ended up commanding. The perfect pick, right? It was extraordinary, uncanny, in fact. So I say this because when we think about the future of Southeast Asia, no one country has an answer to the Myanmar problem, right? But we all have a big role we can play, I think. Now, Julie Bishop, my Chancellor from the Australian National University, former Foreign Minister, has just been appointed the UN Representative on Myanmar, and I'm hoping that she will be supported into finding a way, a bit like Gareth Evans did with the crisis of 1992, and a bit like John Howard did in 1999, to find a way for us in the neighbourhood to pull together, in which the United States played a key role. The United States' role was to facilitate the UN votes, to provide critical logistical support and intelligence support. So the United States does not need to play a leading role in this space, but it has a critical supportive role. All right. I've gone on about that. Well, there's so many challenges it does my head in, right? The West Papua one. This one, of course, worries Indonesia deeply because we were involved in the independence of East Timor, even though, Australians like to say, hang on a minute, it was Habibie's call, not John Howard's call. Nonetheless, there is a sense that Australia is going to do the same over West Papua because of the Free Papua movement, the Organisasi Papuan Merdeka, OPM, as they call it, or they used to call it. Of course, people forget that the Australian Defence Force was almost completely absorbed by dealing with that in a compliant context with the Indonesian military, Tentara Nasional Indonesia, TNI, TNI, agreed and allowed. It was a permissive environment. Were that to be different, in this context, it's completely different. That's been recognised by the UN. It's about 20 times the size of East Timor. There's no way on God's earth Australia is going to confront Indonesia over that. It just isn't happening. But it's important to be mindful of this because this is something that keeps coming up in the context that it's the new pebble in the shoe, if you like, that Ali Alatas used to describe East Timor. It's an ongoing concern. It is one that for Australia is very important to manage and for Indonesia to understand Australia's limitations. Thailand Southern Insurgency. This one's been going for generations. Of course, flared up in 2004 after Thaksin removed the military from running the show in the south because he was a former police officer. He gave the job to the police. And of course, as soon as he did that, the network of informants that the Thai military had was topped almost overnight. They went blind, and of course, things unraveled. And they've been bubbling away for 20 years since, with the military not willing to come up with an accord, a Matignon-like accord, if I dare I say. And of course, there's other challenges in the Philippines. We've seen this with Marawi and so on, with the pocket there of this kind of more hardline Sunni Islamic kind of context where the Battle of Marawi happens, where the borderline of the extension of the Islamic world from the 1700s, butting up against the Catholic world, the Christian world, the Western world, if you like. And that's that rub point there. Of course, when we think about going back to Myanmar, the consequence of the Chalpu pipeline from the Bay of Bengal right up to Yunnan and Kunming is it helps explain why China is so interested in supporting whoever runs the show. For them, the calculus, of course, remains that it's the military. what used to be known as the Tatmadaw, but I've been cautioned by my Burmese friends to stop calling it that because it's a mark of respect and it's not appreciated because this is a bunch of thugs. And I have written in support of engagement with the military in Myanmar before, but that was 12 years ago in the early days when there was some hope, there was some belief that we could possibly do something. I no longer hold that position. And of course, there's transnational security challenges. They're dime a dozen, and of course, they're ones that we've seen in the past with the Bali bombings, the bombings in Jakarta, let alone Marawi, and the fear of this being repeated. There are many other ones in the Mekong River Valley as well that are transnational, that involve not only the Theravada Buddhist countries, Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and also, of course, Vietnam. But of course, the big one is, of course, China, because it owns the dams upriver, and of course, it has the most significant consequential influence in Southeast Asia. And then, of course, there's the good old South China Sea. Nothing to see here, folks. Nothing to worry about. Surely. Of course, it's a devilishly difficult one to unravel. I particularly like this one on the right, which shows how the close proximity of ones controlled by Vietnam, the ones controlled by the Philippines, by Malaysia, by mainland China, and by Taiwan. It is such a mess. But of course, the Arbitral Tribunal ruling in 2016 appeared to make this provide clarity, but of course, China ignored it, and of course, then Duterte Harry walked away from it as well. Go ahead, make my day. As I like to say about Duterte Harry, certainly that was his gunslinger approach to control of criminal groups in Manila. His successor, of course, has changed course and taken a much harder line, going back to the 2016 ruling, and now calling on the United States to make the kind of commitment that President Obama was called to make over the Scarborough Shoal out here, right? Which of course now is Chinese dominated. But the red line, the idea of the United States mapping out a red line, has not worked out very well in the past. Okay, and of course, Second Thomas Shoal is the one where we now see in the news where the Chinese water cannons are being used against Philippines initiatives. The Second Thomas Shoal in around here. I don't have it marked on this particular map, but it's the new Scarborough Shoal, right? Will the United States support the Philippines over this tidal shoal that's inconsequential other than for the Sierra Madre being beached on it. So it doesn't justify legal acknowledgement as accruing a 12 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. It is within the Philippines exclusive economic zone as far as it is recognised, mindful of the fact that there is some dispute over whose exclusive economic zone these things belong to. So it is really a mixed up play. And this, of course, I think goes into what I would call the unrestricted competition. Now, there was a book came out in the late 90s called Unrestricted Warfare. It talked about psychological, media, and legal warfare. And at the time, it seemed over the top. And of course, in English, we have this binary of peace and war. The idea of war just seemed over the top. It's not what we live in. We're living at peace. But of course, what we're living in is, I would contend, better described as unrestricted competition. And we're seeing that unfold at Second Thomas Shoal and elsewhere. Why? Because no one's been shot at with gunpowder, right? A water cannon does not cut it. It is not crossing the kinetic threshold that triggers a war. It is nonetheless unrestricted in the sense of being very competitive and very, very demanding, very challenging for Philippines, for the United States, for Australia, Japan, and others who are looking on the sidelines, wondering how we respond. What do we do about it? And so I would contend that what we're dealing with is this competition prism. We're facing all of this everywhere, all at once. Compromise, confrontation, collaboration, cooperation, contestation, bordering on conflict. And it's trying to avoid crossing that kinetic threshold because of the consequence of that. Now, for Australia, as we look onto the neighbourhood, we think about how we've committed to US-led causes. worried the fact that quite often it generates social blowback, as it did in the Vietnam War, and as I wrote about in a couple of the books I've written over the years. And of course, Australia's seen a demographic transformation from white Australia, which it abandoned in 1967, to becoming a much more multicultural nation, where about a quarter of us are actually born overseas. And about half of that is from Asia. Quite a transformation. But Australia has also led, as I wrote about in East Timor intervention there in the middle, and followed, be it in the Korean War, the book on the left, or in Afghanistan and Iraq in my niche wars book. So Australia is engaged. We have been distracted by events in the Middle East, much like the United States, but we are trying to struggling to reconcile what I call the dialectic of our history and our geography. Our history as essentially an Anglosphere country, an Anglo-European transplanted community on the edge of Asia, and the fact of where we live in the Indo-Pacific on the edge of Asia, with an increasingly cosmopolitan mix of people, much like the United States, much like Canada, these similar New World federal bicameral constitutional democracies. But we have few of us actually, I like to say Australians are barely monolingual because, our English is hardly understandable for crying out of and then, of course, we don't speak anything else. I mean, you guys have to learn what we speak. But we also have a fear of abandonment and a fear of entrapment. Alan Gyngell, the late, great Alan Gyngell, wrote about this fear of abandonment and our reliance on great and powerful friends. In the first half of the 20th century, it's the British, and in the second half of the 20th century, it's the United States. Mindful that the ANZUS Treaty, the only security treaty we have with the United States, is an 800-word essay that says very little, right? It actually, there's no Article 5 security guarantee. There's no headquarters ANZUS, unlike a headquarters NATO. There's no commanding general. Or there's no forces assigned, there's no great command and control architecture, there's just a woolly arrangement. So there is a fear of American isolationism and of potential internal disruption and retreat from global institutions. Ironically, though, if the US becomes more isolationist, we in Australia feel that we'll need more advanced American technology to compensate for American withdrawal. And of course, as Australia engages in Southeast Asia, the question is, how do our neighbours in Southeast Asia respond? And in my experience, in meetings, I ran a course called Southeast Asia Security Choices, taking students to Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand in December. What became clear, and reinforced the view we experienced before in the research I did on the US-Thai Alliance book with my colleague Greg Raymond, was that behind closed doors, most people want the United States to remain engaged and appreciate Australia's engagement. They're just not too keen about doing so publicly. They want to do it behind closed doors. For Australia, history and geography resonates, as I say, in 1942. When we think about the conflicts where we deployed forces in 1941 to stem the Japanese tide. We did so with not the right numbers because we deployed most of our forces to the Middle East in support of the British, fighting the Germans and the Italians, not realising that we actually needed them to defend Australia and our own patch. But these names, Ambon, Timor, Java, New Guinea, Singapore, Balikpapan, Tarakan, Labuan, Padang, and Hollandia, these are all names that are etched in Australian military history. This is our history. This is where we fought when we felt we faced an existential crisis. It's been in our neighbourhood. And yet today, when we think about the defence strategies of the past, we had in the late Cold War years this kind of fear of Indonesia still because of konfrontasi, going back to the 1960s when Sukarno was president, left-leaning support of the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party. There was a fear that perhaps Indonesia could do something like that to Australia. Really, it was not a very credible scenario, but it justified a defence force. Now, of course, what we're looking at is, in fact, engaging with Indonesia, not as a fearful potential competitor, but as a partner. And of course, this is something that the Indonesians don't feel all that warm about because they like their bebas dan active, free and active foreign policy. Right? So when we think about the challenges of the past, we felt the Cold War's hot war zone and the domino theory is considered well and truly past, and yet we're still quite nervous. So we engage in the Pacific, We engage in Southeast Asia with the Defence Cooperation Program, with military educational scholarships and so on. And we've got the five-power defence arrangement with Malaysia and Singapore, which is kind of an anachronism, and yet it's one that no one wants to let go of because it has enduring utility. It keeps the five countries still talking to each other, engaging with each other, and collaborating on a range of activities, such as the five-power defence arrangement, integrated area defence system, which has an Australian commander, and this idea of the Suman stuff. Suman, I thought, what the blazes is a Suman? It's Singapore, UK, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand. No. It took me a while. And Operation Gateway, so collaborating particularly with Malaysia and Singapore on South China Sea and North Indian Ocean patrols. Now, I can talk about Singapore, Thailand. There's the king of Thailand, Adun Troonboi. The investment in our relationship with Thailand has over generations proven useful. Of course, we've engaged with the Philippines. I won't dwell on this because I've run out of time. On Brunei, and I could come back to any of this if we had in Q&A. On Laos, on Cambodia, on Myanmar, and on Indonesia. No, Indonesia is the key one. This is the one we've been playing a game of snakes and ladders with. Snakes and ladders, the game where you incrementally go up the ladder, and then, of course, you get a snake and you come way back down again. How do we do that? We do it over beef, over boats, over spies, over clemency, over Timor, over Papua, over Jerusalem. OMG, can we stop poking Indonesia in the eye? Right? Why? Because we don't even know we're doing it. We, as I say, we're barely monolingual. We don't understand Indonesia. And we haven't really stopped to think about why that had happened. So we've got a foreign policy that focuses, since Trump's first election, on what I call Foreign Policy Plan B, which is OMG, what do we do now, right? And that is, of course, we look to engage with all and sundry as best as possible, with anybody who'll talk with us. ASEAN, Pacific Islands Forum, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, the Quad, AUKUS, the five-power defence arrangement with NATO, anybody. Free trade agreements with anyone as well. Of course, a range of other agreements, which I don't have time to deal with. But of course, on top of that, we're dealing with exacerbated trends of flood, fires, pandemics, cyber terrorism, etc., which is doing our heads in, right? And of course, when we think about Australia and the Defence Force, we have a Defence Force structured for the unipolar moment, the end of the Cold War, when we're all holding hands singing Kumbaya, right? That moment has passed. And yet in Australia, and I think the US as well, we have not caught up with the spectrum of challenges we're having to respond to. And Australia has dealt with these with our boutique defence force because they've happened consecutively. They start happening concurrently, and they are starting to happen concurrently. We're in a world of hurt, and our neighbourhood is in a world of hurt. So when we think about my bluff, my bottom line up front, we're facing everything, everywhere, all at once. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John, for that riveting and extremely detail-rich presentation. I'll remind people who are zooming in, if you have questions, please enter your questions on the Q&A. Maybe before we start with questions, I'll take the chair's prerogative by asking you one. I think you're right that there's a certain degree of fear in Australia and Southeast Asia about U.S. engagement or U.S. withdrawal from the region, patterns of U.S. isolationism that might return in the coming years. But I guess I'd add that Australia also has its own swings in its foreign policy approach, whether you call it isolationist or swinging toward trying to rebuilding ties with China, with the US, engaging with Southeast Asia. To what extent do you think there's fear in Southeast Asia that Australia would abandon the region, that Australia would not sufficiently engage in the region? And how do you think that would affect some of the internal dynamics in ASEAN, perhaps including with the Myanmar crisis or other potential crises in the future?
No, that's a great question, Richard. So I think there is a genuine fear about the limits of Australian engagement. I think there's also a sense that Australia is not ever going to abandon Southeast Asia, but that Australia may just, because we live right next door, we can't, it's of enduring consequence for us, as I've tried to illustrate. But there is a sense that, well, maybe we won't put enough effort in, put enough elbow grease into our efforts there. Our involvement in Cambodia and East Timor and our collaboration with ASEAN, we've just had an Australia-ASEAN special summit back in March in Melbourne, which was about reinforcing this sense of reassurance to our neighbours in Southeast Asia that we're serious about engagement with the neighbourhood and that we're doing it as a bone of, as a genuine, with genuine goodwill towards the region. But it's fair to say the history has seen us ebb and flow in terms of retreat when we felt that was okay. But to be fair, when we have done that, it's been periods of fairly benign economic and political dynamics at play in Southeast Asia, and particularly in the years after the completion of the invasion of South Vietnam by North Vietnam and the fall of Cambodia, a sense that that's now settled. As Lee Kuan Yew said, the dominoes didn't keep falling, because they weren't going to, for a variety of reasons. They weren't going to. So from 75 onwards, Australia retreats into this defence of Australia, behind the moat kind of foreign and defence policy. But to be fair, on the foreign policy front, Australia's still quite active. And we also don't leave the five-power defence arrangement. So we stay involved in Malaysia and Singapore. It just becomes more low-key. And also, throughout this period, we're also still running the Defence Cooperation Program. So we've got thousands of graduates from Southeast Asian colleges who've been running through this program without headlines. So that's on the Defence Cooperation front. The Australia Awards, the Old Colombo Plan. There are thousands, tens of thousands of Australian graduates that are scattered around Southeast Asia, who we hope are well disposed towards Australia. And that is kind of the soft power investment in the neighbourhood that I think speaks to the view that while Australia may ebb and flow, it may appear a bit hot and cold on certain aspects, there is, I think, by and large, a bipartisan agreement that Southeast Asia really matters to Australia. And that while other things do too, China matters, the US matters, NATO matters, all these other things matter, but no one's ever going to tow us away from Southeast Asia. We have to make that work. It's incredibly consequential for us. And that's the world we're in. Thanks, Richard.
Excellent. See questions from the floor. James.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, thanks for mic'd up. So thank you very much for that really informative talk. So you pointed out you mentioned your friends in Myanmar not wanting to use Tatmadaw for the military went
yeah.
And I've been seeing your appreciation for maps and labeling and things like that, whether we should cleanse our vocabulary a little bit, speaking of the South China Sea, and start thinking of more nuanced terms for the West Philippine Sea, or perhaps the East Vietnamese Sea, or whatever, that to market us. I mean, it seems to me, the more we keep it in those maps. But in any case, that's just a quick comment. But I was intrigued by your question about this Venn diagram that you have here about the middle section and this polycrisis that we have. I mean, it seems to me, you said that who owns that, right? It seems to me that maybe not owning it is the right term, but it seems to me the responsibility is precisely in universities like ANU, like Harvard, like places that should have the ability to address those problems in sophisticated, important, nuanced ways. But the problem is, I don't know what ANU is structured like, but Harvard at least, the problem is that Venn diagram, rather than overlapping, gets pulled apart where those three circles get separated in really unfortunate ways, I think.
Yes.
So that's, again, just a quick just comment on that. I had one other question. I can't remember what it is. Oh, actually, I would love to hear your comments. This is just because of your expertise in defense and things like that. So we had Marcos Jr. just in DC recently, right, to sign this military agreement to repopulate bases in the Philippines with the US, and just wondered what your thoughts are on that in terms of what's happening in the region. How does Australia feel about that? So thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, James. So on the last one first, government policy has been quite supportive of that. mindful, of course, also that there's sometimes blowback from, in World War II, we had a very significant American presence in Australia, which was overwhelmingly welcome, but occasionally got unwelcome. And there was a so-called Battle of Brisbane in 1943, when it was the slogan was overpaid, oversexed, over here. It was really because, American soldiers and sailors were paid better than the Australians, and they had this very cool accent the Australian girls really liked. And the Aussie guys, the Aussie soldiers, resented it, and it generated all sorts of fights around the bars, around downtown Brisbane, which echoes some of the challenges the Philippines has had in the past. So careful what you wish for. I think there are limits to how far you go down this path. Mindful that really the key thing is in terms of access and the question about the security guarantees, what the United States is going to do, particularly about Second Thomas Shoal. Are you make a guarantee like you did about the Scarborough Shoal and then not follow up on it? What does that say? What are the implications for Chinese? Because to be honest, my reading of what's happening around Second Thomas Shoal, and it's purely conjecture. I can't prove this. It's a theory, and that is that this is actually a warm-up act for Taiwan. This is what you do. You squeeze them out. You impose embargo. So you actually don't declare war. You just make it devilishly difficult to continue the status quo. And I think that's probably where China wants to go with Taiwan. And that's the bigger implication here. And that's where I think the United States need to be thinking about, okay, what we do over Second Thomas Shoal, what does this say? What does this telegraph to China about how it can handle its potential for imposing an embargo on Taiwan, which we've already seen them exercise. We've seen them try that after Nancy Pelosi's visit. Just on your other point, I left out the fact I'm of the view that we should be encouraging exchange. American students should come and spend a semester in Australia. You can come at ANU, which I think is the best university in Australia. That's where I'm from. I'm biased. I acknowledge that. But it is a truly inspiring place to come and study. You will see the world from a different angle. It will cast different shadows on the same problem if you come and study in Australia. Now, I'm from the College of Asia and the Pacific. We're the only university in the world with a college dedicated to the study of the Asia and the Pacific. That's where I live. That's my office on the third floor. That's where I live when I'm not in DC. It's a wonderful institution. We've got a number of bodies in there, the Crawford School, the National Security College, the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs, where I sit in the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. We've got a lot of things. We've got nuclear physics, we've got astrophysics. The closest thing, I think, to what you're just saying, though, James, is this one on the left, the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, which is a transdisciplinary cross-campus attempt to actually pull together responses to aspects of the polycrisis. And of course, my new Vice-Chancellor President is the red-haired lady on the right who founded the School of Cybernetics, which is really significant when you think about the kind of challenges of the human machine interface, which cybernetics is all about, which we're doing some very interesting exploratory work in Australia. A few other points there. Our university is part of the IARU, the International Alliance of Research Universities. We're also part of the Group of 8. And these are the leading universities in Australia where you can go and study. And they're dealing with the same kinds of issues in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, and West and Perth. But in the ANU, this is what we've got. So we've got all these various colleges of engineering, computing science, cybernetics, science, Asia and the Pacific, arts and social sciences, the traditional ones, law, health and medicine, business and economics, standard range. But as I say, with an Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, trying to pull aspects of this together. I've actually written a paper advocating for establishment of an institute, a National Institute of Net Assessment, which I think should be housed at an institution like ANU, and that we should look to perhaps collaborate with Harvard and with like-minded universities to think about how we actually deal with the polycrisis. bringing together the expertise, the excellence that we have here in Cambridge and in Canberra and in Sydney and Melbourne and elsewhere. Because we are facing the same challenges in Singapore, in Jakarta, Bangkok, and Hanoi. The same challenges, just with a different spin. There are different dimensions to it, but we all have to address all of those aspects of the polycrisis. We all have something we can contribute. Now, we've got Australia, got the internship program, and we've got a visa scheme to get people in. We're keen to get people to come. And there are other universities, as I say, in the group of 8. So it's not just ANU. I am employed by the Australian National University, but I have been given a remit to be collegial. Because the challenge we face is beyond any one campus. So we have to think about how we can pull together. Great question. Thank you for the opportunity.
Can faculty apply to be students there?
Well, you know, we do encourage, we have opportunities arise, but we're trying to encourage study abroad, because at the moment it's 64 cents to the dollar. So it's incredibly cheap for Americans to come and study in Australia, and you get a freaking awesome experience. Right? And if you're under 21, you'll have the time of your life. That's just a result.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. No, in the audience. See, okay, maybe I'll ask a final question or second last question. Some observers in the West to Southeast Asia think there might be a kind of pivot back to the West in the region. Last year, the Thai national elections saw the largest party was fairly enthusiastically pro-Western, pro-United States political party, gaining the plurality of the votes, plurality of the seats in the legislature. In the Philippines, the new president, now not so new president, has done a pivot more toward cooperation with the U.S. military. In Indonesia, the new president speaks many Western or European languages, seems to be interested in more collaborations with the United States. Do you see that kind of pivot going on? And how do you think Australia or the United States should respond to some of those political trends?
So I think we can't rest on our laurels. We can't assume that that is the ongoing trend. And we have to remember that we are in what I describe as unrestricted competition. It's a sport. It's a race, if you like. And some people think competition is a bad thing. I actually think, much like in the Cold War, the fact that the Soviets launched Sputnik triggered a reaction in the United States that led to humans being on the moon a decade and a bit later. So competition isn't all bad. It's actually can be quite healthy. And I think there are some opportunities for us to see this as a challenge, to think about, okay, let's be the best of ourselves. Let's do the best we can. Let's see about how we can contribute to resolving the crises, the polycrisis that we're facing, and persuade our friends and partners and potential allies and former allies and current allies that what we've got to offer is the best option. But we can't assume that that's going to happen. And we think about the polling that's happened, particularly after the war in Gaza. We've seen particularly that some suggest that there's now a swing towards China, a worry that the United States is being, hypocritical. I think, though, there's 2 things. One is that people are canning the so-called rules-based global order. I like to describe it, it's a bit like the Holy Roman Empire, right? Not holy, not Roman, and barely an empire, right? But it existed for hundreds of years, right? So it's like the rules-based global order. Yes, of course, there's 1,001 exceptions, and the United States is the worst offender. And yet the United States is the greatest instigator of the rules-based order. We've all been beneficiaries of this international rules-based system that emerged after the Second World War, which you guys helped set up, right? It wouldn't have happened were it not for the San Francisco Treaty. Where's San Francisco? Where's UN New York? Right? This is the United States' child, if you like. These are institutions the world has benefited from because of American investment and leadership. And so it's worrying to see the United States retreat from this ideation of leadership. It's deeply concerning for middle powers like Australia and middle and small powers in Southeast Asia. We look on and we think, well, okay, everybody, you know, a very interesting conversation I had with a very senior Thai general not that long ago. He's a classmate of mine when I was at Staff College in Thailand. Of course, they go up, and I left the army a long time ago, but in Thailand you never leave, right? You know, so he says to me, John, he came to my office, he said, John, where are you guys? I'm getting China knocking on my door almost every day, and I'm rarely getting knocked on the door by the US or Australia. Right? What are we supposed to do? And I thought it was really telling. So we have a role to play. If we want to influence the dynamics at play in Southeast Asia, there is a role to play. But another point just about that polling suggesting the influence on China, I think we need to remember that there is a bit of a schism, many schisms in Southeast Asia.
You're referring to the ISIS poll of Singapore.
Yeah, that's right. The ISIS poll out of Singapore, which suggested that the Southeast Asia is now leaning more towards China than the United States. Of course, informed by the war in Gaza and informed by the very dominant the numbers coming out of Malaysia and Indonesia, which are predominantly Muslim countries, where there is a political affinity to the case of the Palestinians and of the people in Gaza. That how much of a long-term effect that will have on the opinions is hard to gauge. So I don't think we can use that as an enduring benchmark of what's happening. It is, I think, directly consequential of the war, and how we overcome that, how we recover from that, if you like, is yet to be determined. But it is a very consequential factor that reverberates today throughout the Islamic part of Southeast Asia, and is likely to lead to considerable additional challenges in the future. Thanks, Richard.
Okay, thank you so much to John for this presentation. That concludes the main in-person session, but I invite everyone here to stay for lunch, which will be outside, and John and myself and others from the Asia Center will be around as well to chat. So thank you for coming in. Thank you to John.
Thank you, Richard.
Sharing.
Great to be with you.